Now, as we come along in our answer series, we are now down to the question, can you explain the Nephilim in Genesis 6? And my answer to that is, why, yes, I can. I sure can. Now, the big hoopla about all of this is, were the Nephilim angels, or were the Nephilim giants, or were they neither? Well, I want to take you through this passage, and I want to show you what the passage actually says to us. Now, when the full question came into me from the class, the question was this: were the Nephilim mentioned and described as sons of God, in fact angels, or spiritual beings, with which God became angry because they married the daughters of men and produced mighty men of old? Does the Bible mention Nephilim anywhere else, and to whom does the 120 years refer? Men, or the Nephilim, or someone else? And so we've got these questions. We got the questions about the Nephilim. Are they angels? Are they spiritual beings? Are they someone else? The daughters of men. We've got the mighty men here. We've got the question is Nephilim only here in Genesis 6? And then we've got the question about the 120 years. Does that refer to the Nephilim? Does that refer to someone else? Who does that refer to? Well, in order to get started, I want to present to you a timeline pretty quick here. The timeline of Genesis. Now, in Genesis chapter 1 and 2, it was about creation. The 6 days of creation, Adam and Eve, you know that story. Then when we move to Genesis chapter 3, this is about the fall of Adam, and specifically because they took of the fruit of the tree and they actually ate of it, which was absolutely against God's command. And so therefore, they were cast out of the Garden of Eden there in Genesis chapter 3. Then when we move to Genesis chapter 4, Adam and Eve have had two sons, one by the name of Abel and one by the name of Cain. Cain became very angry at Abel because they offered an offering, and the Lord accepted Abel's offering, but he rejected Cain's offering. And there in chapter 4, Cain kills Abel. And when Cain kills Abel, even after God had warned him, the Lord had warned him not to do what he was thinking about doing, but to master the sin he was thinking about before it mastered him. What happened was then when Abel was dead, Cain was not allowed to stay with Adam and Eve. And so the camp of Adam and Eve stayed just outside the Garden of Eden. But the camp of Cain took a sister to be his wife, and they moved out away to the east into what's called the land of Nob, I should say. And they went out there, and that's where their camp began to develop. So we've got a division line. There's a division line between the ungodly of Cain's line and the godly of Adam's line. Adam's going to have a son by the name of Seth, who is going to continue the godly line through Seth, all the way down to Jesus, in fact. Seth is going to have a son by the name of Enosh, and it's with the birth of Enosh that man began to call, the godly line began to call upon the name of the Lord for their salvation. Cain's line doesn't begin to call upon the name of the Lord. Seth's line begins to call upon the name of the Lord. Then as we move into Genesis chapter 5, Genesis chapter 5 is a genealogy of the godly line. Of course, we know Adam and Eve came in chapters 1 and 2, but starting with Seth, he begins in chapter 5 all the way down to the birth of Noah. That is, and all the people in between, that's all in chapter 5, and that covers to the birth of Noah 1,049 years. Now, we looked at this in the very first lessons entitled, How Old is the World? And so with that, Genesis chapter 5 tells us the line of the godly people, the line of the godly people. Now, if we begin to look back and we look at the line of the godly people there in Genesis chapter 5, you will remember that I said all we're looking at in how old is the world is how old the men were between each birth, and we'd stack those together. And I told you that in each of those lessons, each of those little entries about the different men, about Adam and Seth and Enosh and Kenan, all the way down to Noah, that they lived so many years and they had other sons and daughters. Now, what is interesting about that is I told you back then, we didn't need to know about how long they lived. Now, that was in How Old Is the World? But now in this lesson, we need to know how old they live. And in fact, in this chart that I'm showing you right now, after Seth was born, Cain is living off with his ungodly family over to the east. Men began to multiply on the face of the earth, okay? Now, I want you to look at this chart, okay? Adam, Seth, Enosh, Kenan, Mahalalel, Jared, Enoch, Methuselah, Lamech, and Noah. Noah's going to have a son by the name of Shem. I want you to see, I've got a line pointing down at the end of Adam's life. And I want you to see that Adam lived long enough to see all the way and know everyone all the way down to Lamech. And Lamech was 62 years old when Adam died. Noah never knew Adam, but Adam knew Noah's father. Then, when Noah is born, Noah's going to live 500 years before the flood. But 120 years before the flood, there is an announcement by the Lord that only 120 years would be left until the Lord would bring judgment. Now, this is very important because I want you to see who was alive during the time or at the beginning of the 120 years. In fact, it's very important that you see this, that you see that Methuselah, Lamech, and Noah were all alive during that last 120 years. The reason why I've got a box that's in red around this is I want you to see who all was alive, when, and where, all right? About 1,500 years of marriages between the godly and the ungodly are taking place. And in 1,500 years, you can have a lot of kiddos, a lot of grandbabies, a lot of great-grandbabies, and so on and so on and so on and so on, that Adam saw during most of this 1,500 years, all the way down to when Lamech was 62 years old. Shem's not born yet. In fact, when the decree from the Lord, which we're going to read about in a little bit, occurs, 120 years before the flood, Shem has not been born yet. He is not going to be born for another 22 years. Okay, but I also want you to see something else. Notice I have on the chart also the flood, which occurred, and I put the BC dates here, 2478 BC. And then I want you to see that Shem lived on after he rode on the ark with his two brothers, the three sister-in-laws, his mom and dad, Noah and Mrs. Noah. And Shem lived on past the birth of Abraham. He lived past the birth of Isaac. He lived until the year that Jacob and Esau were born. Abraham will only live 15 years longer after the death of Shem. So the point here is all the way from Adam to Jacob and Esau, we have a continuation because Shem knew Methuselah and Lamech, who knew Adam. Shem knew Noah, who knew Methuselah and Lamech. Shem then was old enough and lived in the same area as Abraham, Ur of Chaldees area and all that. Same area with Isaac, Jacob, Esau. They had to know each other so that this story about Adam was true and it transcended over the flood and went all the way to Jacob and Esau. Now, as we turn in our pages to get to Genesis chapter 6, what we have seen through Genesis chapter 1 through Genesis chapter 5 is basically the fall of man and the ungodly line and the godly line. And as Genesis chapter 6 picks up with the Nephilim. The Nephilim. So we've got the camp of Cain to the east of Adam's camp. We've got Adam's camp just outside the garden. There's a division between the two. And then lo and behold, in Genesis chapter 6, takes up a span of 1,500 years of having babies where the godly are marrying with the ungodly and all of that. We come to this word, the Nephilim. Now, the first mention of the sons of God and the daughters of men, which was mentioned in the question, occurs right off the bat in this, in the Genesis chapter 6 passage. Read along with me. Now it came about when men began to multiply on the face of the land, and daughters were born to them. Okay, so we've got all these girls being born in Adam's camp of the godly, in Cain's camp of the ungodly, that the sons of God saw that the daughters of men were beautiful, and they took wives for themselves, whomever they chose. Okay, now this is interesting. Two things we can bring out of this. First of all, if you remember in Genesis chapter 1:28, the Lord instructed Adam and Eve to be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth and subdue it and rule over the fish of the sea and the birds of the sky and over every living thing that moves on the earth. So the first thing that happens is Adam and Eve begin to have kids, and they have kiddos, and they have grandkiddos, and they have great-grandkiddos, and those kiddos begin to marry, and all this just and they are doing and fulfilling the command of the Lord to multiply, be fruitful, and to multiply. Second, the sons of God saw the daughters of men were beautiful, and they took wives for themselves, whomever they chose. So here we have problem terms here. Here they are. The sons of God and the daughters of men. Okay, now we've got to go back to the context of Genesis 1 through 6. Cain's camp settled east of Eden in the land of Nod. The word Nod means wandering. So they just went off and they became nomads, and they just started wandering around, all around. Now in Genesis 5, backing up a chapter, which covered the godly line of Adam to Noah, all had other sons and daughters besides the son that's mentioned in Genesis 5 in this godly line. So we've got daughters being born to these godly men. We've got multiple sons being born to these godly men. And only one of those multiple sons is the godly son that carries on. So they're beginning to fulfill the earth and multiply all over the face of the earth. And in that third generation, which is whenever the evil begins to occur with the mixing of the camps, probably, is with Enosh, is when they began to call upon the name of the Lord for their salvation. Now, it's interesting because the scripture tells us that these sons of God began to take wives, and check this out, whomever they chose. So what is happening here is the sons of the godly line of Adam, who are calling upon the name of the Lord, they are considered sons of God, began to take wives, whomever they chose, from either the godly line, right there with Adam, or from the ungodly line with Cain, over with Cain, east of camp. And the division between the godly and the ungodly was totally ignored. And the camps began to merge. The arrows that you see there pointing both directions. Some of Adam's sons began to marry the daughters of Cain's line. Some of Cain's sons began to marry the daughters of Adam's line. And this all began to mix and to mingle. And the division of the camps of Adam and Cain were totally ignored. And what is occurring is the same problem that was occurring in Cain's camp that caused his camp to have to leave Adam's camp in the first place, was the spread of the moral breakdown in the society of these two different camps because they're intermarrying. Hey, listen, Solomon's going to have the same problem when he begins to marry all these foreign wives and bring in their religions and their morality into the temple in Jerusalem. It's going to be a disaster for Solomon and really for the nation of Israel when all that occurs. The same thing is happening here during this 1500 years before the flood. All right, now, what I want you to understand is, with Adam's line, the godly line, those raised rightly began to choose wrongly. Now we come in verse number 3 to the first mention of the 120 years. That is a question with so many people. Genesis chapter 6, verse 3, read along with me. Then the Lord said, my spirit shall not strive with man forever. In other words, I'm not going to let this go on forever. I'm not going to do this. I'm going to bring it into it. Because he also is flesh. Nevertheless, his days shall be 120 years. Now, we all, growing up, even I growing up, we tried to make this that they were going to be able to live for 120 years. Now, they've been living for 800, 900, all that kind of years, but the Lord is going to move it down to 120 years, of which, of course, that has not happened. We are down now lower than that. But what the Lord is saying here is, I'm not going to let this continue on. I am not going to strive with this much longer. So I'm going to give it 120 more years. And when the 120 years is up, I am going to bring the judgment. Okay, so going back to our chart here that I've shown you already, the overlapping lives of Adam's godly line leading to the flood, you'll see right there, the Lord makes this decree there's going to be 120 years left, and then will come the judgment. Now we come to the first mention of the Nephilim. Now watch here. The Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterward, when the sons of God came into the daughters of men, and they bore children to them. Those were the mighty men who were of old, men of renown. This is the passage that causes the problem with most folks in understanding this passage. You see that word, those, that I have circled? The question is who are the those? Who is the those referring to? You also see it was in those days and afterwards, okay? So in other words, whoever those are, they were around in those days, and they were also around afterward. Now, those could refer to the Nephilim, or those could refer to the children that were born from the sons of God who came into the daughters of men, and they bore children. Now, I've grayed out the words there so you can just see. It could be either of those two. And look what else it says there again. Those were the mighty men who were of old, men of renown. So, was it the children of the sons of God, the daughters of men who were born, the babies, the grandbabies, the great-grandbabies, who became the mighty men of old, men of renown? Or was it the Nephilim who were the mighty men? So we've got a little problem here that we've got to work out. So just to see, those, is it referring to Nephilim, or is it referring to the children? And the scripture tells us that the Nephilim were those men of renown. Now, the word Nephilim is a plural form of Nephal, and the word Nephal means to fall or fallen. So Nephilim are the mass of the fallen, or those who have fallen away. Now, when we think about that, we have to understand something. There are people who try to translate the word Nephilim but as a giant, but it does not mean giant. The only word in our scripture that is translated giant is Rapha, and it is only found in 2 Samuel 21:16 through 22. It's not, the word giant is not found anywhere else except in this section when it is referring to Goliath and his descendants. In fact, even when David kills Goliath, we're not told that he is a giant. We're not told that he is a giant until David has to fight his sons at the end of his life in 2 Samuel 21. And the only place the word giant is used is there in that passage. And Rapha is the word for giant. Okay, now, back to our passage, verse number 4. The Nephilim are those who were the mighty men who were of old, men of renown. Now that's where I'm going with this. The Nephilim were those who were the mighty men who were of old, the men of renown. Now, I want to tell you this. We don't use the word renown a lot. Now, those of us who are older, we know exactly what it means. But for the younger folks, renown means the reputation, the influence that they have. And in this world of social media, when we are looking for the influencers, these Nephilim were the influencers, leading the people in the charge of how they were to live. So I've just told you, I believe that those refers to the Nephilim. They were on the earth in those days and also afterwards. But there's something that's very interesting here. Okay. When we look back at the context of Genesis chapter 1 through 6, the context, which we've seen all this already before, except for the very bottom line I've put here. In the context of Genesis 1 through 6, these men of renown and their reputation could not have been good. These had to be men with a bad reputation and a bad influence, because that's the whole context of leading all the way from creation through the fall, through Cain's camp away from Adam's, for the intermingling and marrying, from the godly line to tell us who are the godly, and then to come in here in chapter 6 and tell us about these Nephilim who are coming through. And the word Nephilim means the fallen, those who have fallen away. Fallen what? Just like when Adam and Eve, chapter 3 in the Garden of Eden, we call it the fall. Adam and Eve fell away from the commandment of God by eating the fruit of the tree that they were commanded never to touch and not to eat. And then Cain, in chapter 4, Cain kills Abel, and he becomes a fallen in his life. And the Lord warned him. He says, you got a choice here. Make the right choice. But Cain chose the wrong choice. By the way, Adam and Eve in Genesis chapter 3 had the choice also. God has always allowed throughout the entire Bible, no matter what theology is out there and what people are telling you that you don't have any choice, God always has allowed His people to have a choice. Or let me put it this way, allowed the people to have a choice whether to choose Him or not to choose Him, to follow Him or not to follow Him. There's a whole blanket of theology out there today that says, hey, you don't have a choice. God's making all the decisions for you. In fact, He's already decided whether you're going to be saved or not, no matter what you do. He's already decided if you're going to be lost, no matter what you do. You can act holy, 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 Lord God Almighty, and still you're going to burn in the lake of fire. That's not the way it is in Scripture. So these men, because it's all talking about leading to the fall and presenting to us those who are godly men, who are calling upon the name of the Lord, acting as sons of God because they belong to the Lord, they're intermarrying with the daughters of the ungodly, and the children of them, or the offspring of them, begin to have a bad reputation. They are influencing the people badly. Now I will show you this. Okay, now we're back to our verse number 4. I want you to notice something. It says, those Nephilim were mighty men who were of old. That means before the flood to us, because it means that to Moses who's writing it. Men of renown. Now the word men is the Hebrew word ha'adam. Adam's name means man. Okay, so Ha'adam. They're not angels because they are not called angels here. They are called men. Ham-Malek is the Hebrew word for angels. We have the word angels throughout our Bible. If these were the mighty angels who were of old, angels of renown, they would have been called angels because we've already had the word angel come up in this storyline between Genesis chapter 1 and chapter 6. We've already had them there because the angels shut the gates and blocked the Garden of Eden. We know about angels. These are men. They are not angels. Had they been angels, the Scripture would have told us, but the Scripture is telling us they were men. Now looky here. Remember I also said, okay, were these the children? When the sons of God came to the daughters of men and they bore children to them, those were the mighty men who were of old, men of renown. So Jim, what are you trying to say to us? Here's what I'm trying to say to you is, the Nephilim were the offspring of the sons of God with the daughters of men who grew to become fallen men of renown, ungodly men of renown. They followed in what's called the way of Cain. What was the way of Cain? It was the fallen way of Cain. They were falling and they were failing to choose to do what was right. That is the way of Cain. Verse number 4. You notice it also says, because the question was, were they just here in Genesis 4 or are they someplace else? The Nephilim were on earth in those days and also afterward. Well, afterward means after what? After what are we talking about? When were the Nephilim also here after these days? Well, the next big thing that came along was the flood. That next big event was the flood. It couldn't have been anything else but after the flood. It was after the flood. I want to make that point. Okay, so now, look here. I got me a little frog because a couple of weeks ago we talked about leapfrogging over, and I thought I'll just put a frog in this so you can see. From Genesis chapter 6, verse 4 that we just read about the Nephilim being there in those days, and then afterwards, we can leapfrog, get this over, we can leapfrog over the flood, we can leapfrog over the Tower of Babel, we can leapfrog over the life of Isaac and over the life of Jacob, we can leapfrog over the 430 years that Jacob's family, the nation of Israel, was in the Promised Land, and we can leapfrog over the 10 plagues. We can leapfrog over the Exodus, and we can leapfrog over the first year at Mount Sinai to land in the second year out of Egypt when the 12 spies took their first look into the Promised Land. Now, you know about those 12 spies. They took off and they went north and they went up to the Hebron area and all around that. And they saw that the land was filled with milk and honey, and they brought back huge clusters of grapes and all of this, and they came back with a report. Get this, we have leapfrogged over 1,136 years of time. From the flood to that second year after they came out of Egypt, we have just jumped over all of that, and we've heard nothing about Nephilim in 1,136 years. Oh, but they're there, but we haven't heard about them. In Numbers chapter 13, verses 27 through 33, hold with me here. Let's hear what is said here about the 12 spies, and they brought a report back after they had gone up to see the Promised Land. Now, if you remember here, what's going to happen is they're going to give a report. 10 of the spies are going to say, we can't do this, and we're going to cover that in just a minute. And so the whole nation votes not to do it. They don't trust God enough. Who's taken them through all these plagues and got them out, crossed through the Red Sea, the whole miraculous thing. No. We don't trust God enough that we can go and take the promised land. So these spies come back with this report. Here it is, chapter 13 of Numbers, verse number 27 is where we start reading. We went into the land where you sent us, and it certainly does flow with milk and honey, and this is its fruit. Nevertheless, the people who live in the land are strong, and the cities are fortified and very large. And moreover, we saw the descendants of Anak there. Now pause just a moment. Anak was a group of descendants who were, for all we know about them, of what we know, because we've already studied about them, and we've defeated some of them, and we've run them out in some other areas, or Israel has. They were extremely tall, and they were extremely large men. Now, I'm being very careful not to say they were giants. They weren't extremely big, but they were bigger than the Jews. Now, I want to remind you how big Jews are. Jews are little folks. They are little folks. So these descendants of Anak were there. And Anak, they were Canaanites, folks, okay? They were Canaanites. And so they saw the descendants of Anak there. Now just hold that in your thought. Let's go on to the next verse. Then Caleb quieted the people before Moses and said, we should by all means go up and take possession of it, for we will surely overcome it. Good job, Caleb. What Caleb doesn't know is that's just won him a free ride and a free walk into the promised land, and he's going to get to see it. All the rest of all those 10 who said we can't take it, they're not going to see it. They're going to die in the wilderness. But Caleb and his family are going to get to go in the promised land because of what Caleb just said. Verse number 31. But the men who had gone up with him said, we are not able to go up against the people, for they are too strong for us. So they gave out to the sons of Israel a bad report of the land which they had spied out, saying, the land through which we have gone, in spying it out, is a land that devours its inhabitants. And all the people whom we saw in it are men, and then you see it says, of great size. Well, the problem is, our oldest and most reliable documents do not have in the Hebrew of great size. That's not in the Hebrew. So it just really, the passage ends here by saying, in this verse 32, by saying, is the land devours its inhabitants and all the people whom we saw in it. Or all the men we saw in it, may be a better way of saying it. Well, moving on to verse number 33. And then they say this, there also we saw the Nephilim. Now skip over what I've marked out. And we became like grasshoppers in our own sight, and so we were in their sight. Now what I marked out, you see that it's in parentheses up in the text. In our forward of our Bibles, it tells us that anything in parentheses does not belong where it is there. It's been moved in there by some copyist by accident. The sons of Anak are part of the Nephilim. That phrase is not correct. It doesn't belong there. It is not correct. It's been gathered from two other places and put together. It's not in the Hebrew. So here it says that we also saw the Nephilim. Here is the second mention of the Nephilim here, 1135, 36 years later after we heard about it before the flood. When it says we also saw the Nephilim, it says, and we became like grasshoppers in our own sight. And so we were in their sights. Now here's what I want you to understand about these Nephilim and the sons of Anak. Even though they saw the sons of Anak had nothing to do with the Nephilim in this passage. Remember, the reporters are just telling us that they saw the Nephilim in addition to them seeing the sons of Anak. The two are different groups of men. They are not the same. Verse 29 says, we saw the descendants of Anak. Verse 33 says, there also we saw the Nephilim, two different groups of men. Also, that's what it means. It means in addition to. Now the spies saw these Nephilim, these men of reputation, these men of influence. They're in the promised land. Fallen men in their immorality. Fallen, terrible, ungodly, ruthless men, far from a relationship with the Lord, who had a great influence on other men. Well, let me tell you this, folks. If the Lord brought the flood to end the existence of the Nephilim, who had become so ungodly in everything, the flood didn't do the job, because we've got Nephilim after the flood. These Nephilim are people who have great influence on other men. Put the sons of Anak alongside the Nephilim and their men who they have influence over in battle, and the spies did not think that the nation of Israel could defeat them all. In other words, when we go in there, we're going to hit two groups. We're going to have this group of the Anak, and we're going to have these groups that are head and their leaders are the Nephilim. Verse 31 says, they are too strong for us. And then verse 33, if you remember, we've said, the spies felt like grasshoppers in our own sight. When the 10 spies looked at their situation, they thought they were too weak to defeat the mass of the fallen men of the Nephilim and the strength of the men of Anak. We're too weak. We can't do this. We are like grasshoppers that can be grabbed and crushed in our own sight. In our own sight, that's how we feel. That's the words they use. And of course, in verse number 33, they say, and so we were in their sight. The spies thought that the Nephilim looked down at them and thought, hey, they're no threat. They're no threat as these spies. They're no threat to us. Not at all. They're no threat. Look at them. You know, look how scrawny and small they are. Well, we the Nephilim, we the men of influence, just men, just regular men, not angels, not spiritual built beings, but we are just people who we've got people under our thumb. We got a little black book on everybody, and if we tell them to go kill this, kill that, fight this, fight that, they're going to go do it for us because their livelihood depends on us. And the sons of Anak are also looking down going, hey, they're nothing for us. They're puny. They're just puny. Absolutely puny. Then we come in verse 5 to the first mention of the wickedness of man. We have just left Numbers and we've gone back to Genesis chapter 6. Because we left Genesis chapter 6 when the Nephilim were in the land in those days. How did they come to be in the land where the godly men of Adam's line married the ungodly daughters of Cain's line? And the ungodly men of Cain's line had married the godly daughters of Adam's line. And the whole morality just went to pot. And then we're told about the wickedness of these people. Then the Lord saw that the wickedness of man was great on the earth, and that every intent of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. The men who were born between this mixture of Adam's line and Cain's line, their thoughts were evil at every intent, grotesque. Every sin that you can possibly think, they were wicked. Wicked means evil. They were evil in God's sight. How often? Continually, it says. But the Lord was sorry that he had made man on the earth, and he was grieved in his heart. The Lord said, I will blot out man whom I have created from the face of the land, from man to animals, to creeping things, and to birds of the sky, for I am sorry that I have made them. Notice he didn't say anything about the fish of the sea and anything like that. He's not going to kill the fish of the sea and whatever. It's just everything else that lives on top of the land. The birds, the mammals, and all of that. But it goes on to end by him saying, but Noah found favor in the eyes of the Lord. Back to our overlapping map of the Adam's godly line leading to the flood. I've put the 120 years left in grayed out so that you can see it. The Lord is already told us He's going to not strive but for 120 more years. And He's only not going to do that. He's not going to strive because He has seen that the men are so evil, and the relationships of these Nephilim are so evil, just evil men. They're not angels. They're not spiritual beings. They are men who are living evil, terrible lives. You will see that Noah was alive when he gave the order. In fact, the order comes in. Noah is going to be 600 years old when the flood occurs. So this order is coming from the Lord about the 120 years when Noah is 480 years old. He's not 500 yet. And as that, being 480 years old, he knows Methuselah well. He knows Lamech well. That's his grandfather and his father. Now I want you to see something else. Before the flood occurs, 9 years before the flood occurs, Methuselah dies. 4 years before the flood occurs, Lamech dies. That leaves Noah. But Shem, catch this, Shem was born 22 years after the announcement of the 120 years was left. Shem is going to be 98 when the flood occurs. Here's the important thing. Shem, if you'll notice this, Shem is in his 90s before the deaths of Methuselah and Lamech. Do you see it? Shem is in his 90s before the deaths of Methuselah and Lamech, which means Shem has heard the story of his father, and he's heard the story of Adam and Eve from Lamech and Methuselah who are alive, and he's heard all the story that goes before. Shem has heard it all from the mouths of those who lived it all during that 1500-year period, all the way back to the creation of Adam. Now, I want to give you a note here about angels. Because there is so much out there that these Nephilim were angels. The Nephilim could not have been angels who married the daughters of men. Absolutely could not. And could not have borne children who became the Nephilim. And why? Well, we needed to be told by Jesus why. When the Sadducees were asking about the resurrection and whose wife, a man who had so many wives, whose wife, who would be the wife of the man in heaven? Jesus said to them, you are mistaken, not understanding the Scriptures nor the power of God. For in the resurrection, that's in heaven, when we get to heaven, they neither marry. Interesting word. Marry means to marry up your bodies in a sexual relationship. That's what it means, in a sexual relationship. Every time the word marry comes up in the Bible, it means a man and a woman having a sexual relationship. Sexual relationship in a marriage, as we would call it, when they're wed, after at the wedding, or sexual relationship in a nightly stand, one night stand, when they just meet at a bar or whatever, even today, when they have sex, like all the stuff you see on television, and you just turned a blind eye to it through these years, those people are married in God's eyes here on earth. They are married. They are married couples everywhere who are having sexual relationships. He says they neither marry, have sexual relationships, nor are given in marriage. They don't have a wedding in heaven either. But they are like angels in heaven. We are not angels in heaven, but we are like angels when we get there. We will no longer have a sexual relationship. We will not find somebody in heaven that we're just drooling over and we want to get married. We're not going to be given in marriage, and we're not going to be married and have a sexual relationship. We're going to be exactly like the angels. There are no little baby cherubs in heaven. The word cherub just simply means a single angel of one type. They're called cherubim when they are multiple angels of that same type. That's the plural of it. But there are no little baby cherubs with little bows and arrows in heaven. They are all perfectly formed to be the spiritual messengers of God. They don't marry. They don't have relationships or anything. And so these angels, now I want you to understand this. Even if an angel, a fallen angel, could have entered a body to possess the body of a human, to have a sexual relationship with a human, the angel has nothing to have sex with. Absolutely nothing. So he can use the body to have sex, but what is being transmitted in that sexual relationship of that marriage between the two bodies is human to human. Angels don't have anything to pass on. Angels are spirit beings with no reproductive organs. And so, what are the Nephilim? Let me sum it up for you. The Nephilim were the children, the offspring, and their descendants, the men of the godly line who married the beautiful daughters of Cain's sinful line, and of the men of Cain's sinful line who married the beautiful daughters of Adam's godly line, and the immorality just flooded in as those generations were being born, doing as they pleased, doing what they pleased, and all of that. And as those grandbabies and great-grandbabies and everything all began to grow, they began to form tribes of their own with people following them. And they were people of influence who had a strong, powerful hold over the other people in the area. And they were kings, and they were warriors, and they were disgusting. And most of all, they were wicked. The Nephilim were not angels. They were only men. But they were wicked men for sure.